I don't know what your experience is with modern day courts and judges and that sort of thing. It might be that you have no experience with these things. It might be that you have more experience with these things than you'd want to acknowledge this morning. I think about some of the experiences that I have had and that my family has had. Tirsa and I, when we lived in East Texas and as we lived in Tyler, Texas, and as we adopted our two youngest girls, we did so in Smith County. And in Smith County, there's a family court judge there. Her name is Carol Clark, and she's just awesome. We grew to love her and to appreciate her. She was the judge that governed all of the proceedings toward the adoption of both of our youngest daughters. She, even in her courtroom, as we were waiting for our case time after time again, going to all of these hearings, we would see how she governed others, how she went about doing what she did as a judge. We did learn very early on, especially in Tyler, Texas, that not everyone has the same sort of affection that we have for Judge Carol Clark in East Texas, in Smith County, because as a family court judge, she not only dealt with adoptions, but she dealt with divorces, she dealt with child custody, she dealt with even in adoptions, a part of that process is the termination of parental rights. Even though there's this blessing and gain in adoption, there's always a loss involved as well. And so just thinking about experiences in a courtroom or experiences in front of a judge. When I was a policeman, I time and again, over and over, would find myself in a courtroom in Dallas County. And I worked nights as a police officer. I would work 11 at night to 7 in the morning. And so anytime I went to court was always overtime. So Tirsa was always like, hey, you need to make sure you go to court so you can get that overtime. But I can think of one time in particular. This was just my shining moment in a courtroom as a policeman. I had arrested this guy for some narcotics. And how I came into contact with him, it's middle of the night, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm driving down this small residential street in the east end of Garland. It's the middle of the night, it's totally dark. I'm rolling down the street with my headlights off, with my windows down, just really slow, just because I want to be able to pay attention to what's going on. I want to be able to hear things that are going on around me. You know, if there's dogs barking a couple of streets over, there might be somebody breaking into cars or what have you, just trying to do some good police work. And as I'm driving down this street in the dark, probably 50 feet in front of me or more, I see a guy, middle of the night, and he crosses the street at this main intersection, and there's a street lamp over him, and he's walking across the street, and as he walks, he looks, and he sees me coming down the road at him, and he reaches in his pocket, and he drops a baggie of drugs on the ground, and just kind of keeps on walking. Maybe if I ignore the policeman, he won't bother me. Well, the policeman bothered him. And so I get in touch with him and walk him over to where I had seen him do this sort of movement. Sure enough, there's a baggie of drugs there. I cuff him up and we go to jail. Well, a couple of months later, we go to court in front of the judge, and the defense attorney is asking me some questions, trying to help his client out. And so he says, "Officer, you've testified that this is what you saw and this is what my client did and these were the circumstances." "Yes, that's right." "So you've testified that it's in the middle of the night, it's pitch dark, the only light you have is a street light. How far away were you whenever you saw this?" "I was probably about 50 feet." "So you're 50 feet away, and you see this sort of furtive movement from my client. You see him from 50 feet away in the middle of the night, in the dark. You see him reach in and drop that to the ground, and you're certain it was him. You're certain they're his. You're certain that you've got the right guy." "Yes, I'm certain." "Well, officer, I can see that you wear glasses. What kind of vision do you have?" "Well, how long have you worn glasses?" I'm like, "Well, I've worn glasses for, that time, the last 2 or 3 years." Interesting. So with the glasses on, what sort of vision do you have? Well, I have pretty close to perfect vision with the glasses at the time. I have pretty close to perfect vision with the glasses, really. So you're telling me with glasses in the middle of the night, you can see 50 feet in the dark and you see my client drop this baggie of drugs. Yes, absolutely. That's the truth. That's amazing. Officer, exactly how far can you see at night? To which I responded, I don't know. How far away is the moon? My shining moment in the courtroom. Of course, quickly he said, "Objection, Your Honor." And the judge is like, no, I'm going to let that go. That was funny. I'm not sure for you, I'm not sure what comes to mind when you hear the word judge. It might be that what you think of are the judges on Chopped and The Voice. I don't know. But the judges of Israel, which is what we're going to consider this morning, the judges of Israel are perhaps different than we might even think. And so with that as a beginning, what I want to ask you to do is to turn with me, if you will, to our primary reading, which is going to come from Joshua chapter 2. We're going to consider just a small portion of the book of Judges in order to get a snapshot in time of what the book of Judges is primarily about. And I'm going to begin reading in Judges chapter 2, verse 15 and following. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them. Now this sounds strange to us. But God's hand is against His people because His people have proven unfaithful to Him. You see, it would make sense to us to read this text and we would think, and of course if you look at the context around it, you'll see more of the story. We would expect for God's hand to be with His people, God to be blessing His people, giving His people victory as He's given His people victory time and time again. And yet God's people are being and have been unfaithful to Him. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as He had sworn to them. And they were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors, who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, He was with the judge, and He saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following after other gods, serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and their stubborn ways. Therefore the Lord was angry with Israel and said, "Because this nation has violated the covenant that I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and to see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did." The judges are sort of a combination, military leader and civil ruler for the people of God. That's what the judges are. They're kind of a combination between a military leader and a servant ruler for God's people. And God sends those who would serve as judges, as these leaders, but really it's a Band-Aid on a ruptured artery for them. They just won't stay. They just won't stay on the straight and narrow. If you look at practically each and every section of this book, in each new section in the book of Judges, it begins with something along these lines. Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord, in the eyes of Yahweh. If you look in most of our translations, the word Lord will be in all capital letters, designating this is Yahweh. This is the God of covenant. This is the God of relationship. This is the God who has blessed and who has cared for and who has led His people, who has been with His people before they were His people. And yet Israel does evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so they're oppressed and they cry out to God. God raises up a judge. The people behave godly for a time. But then when the judge dies, they fall into rebellion, they fall into sin again. Rebellion then brings punishment from God, usually oppression from the surrounding nations. Finally, the people, they relent and they cry out for mercy, and then the Lord sends them another judge to deliver them, and then the cycle continues on and on and on. A few standouts that you may or may not be familiar with. Deborah, the judge Deborah, she stands out as a judge of Israel. If you look to Judges chapter 4, primarily she stands out as a woman who is leading the people of God in this capacity. My mother-in-law's name is Deborah. I'd really like to hit pause for a moment and make a few jokes at my mother-in-law's expense, but I'm not going to do that today. My favorite part of the story of Deborah, the time of Deborah as a judge, my favorite part is as she and Barak, her military leader, as she and Barak are leading 10,000 men to defeat the Canaanites. The Canaanites are led by Sisera. As she and Barak and 10,000 men are pursuing the Canaanite enemies, Sisera, who's leading the Canaanite army, he retreats, he runs, and he hides in this Israelite tent, and he finds safety in a tent of an Israelite woman named Jael. And I love the story because Sisera comes in, he finds comfort, he falls asleep, and then Jael, knowing who he is, she drives a tent peg through his head. Nailed him. I got a message from my oldest daughter not 10 minutes before service began, and she sent me all of these Father's Day little memes, and one of the pictures said, "May your Father's Day be better than your jokes." And so I think I told it a lot better in first service. I have with the story not only of Deborah but with the story of Jael. I've been known to, in times past, when some friends of ours maybe are pregnant with a child, and I'm even thinking maybe I might have given this encouragement back here to the Middletons. When a friend is pregnant with a daughter and they're maybe indecisive on what to name the girl, I think it would be awesome to name that little girl Jael, right? That story of her nailing Sisera's head to the ground with that tent peg. But no takers on that yet. The story of Gideon, you may or may not be familiar with. Judges chapter 6. Gideon stands out as one of the judges of Israel. Gideon, he tears down the altars of the nations. If you're familiar with the story, he tests God with the fleece. And then, Judges chapter 7, Gideon, he defeats the Midianites, not with his 30,000 men in his army. God says, no, that's just too many. We don't need that many. And through this process of selecting them, Gideon, rather than taking all 30,000, he only takes 300 who drink from the riverbed by using their hands. It's a great story. I've always loved that story because it demonstrates to us how at just the right time and in just the right way, God gives His people victory. And oftentimes in such a way as to demonstrate that it's from Him. It's not from us. Samson is another one of the judges that obviously stands out. Chapters 13 through 16 of Judges. Perhaps the judge of Israel that gets the most VBS press, I don't know. But the child, Samson, the child who is given by God to a woman who had previously been unable to have a child. It's a theme that we've seen, and it's a theme that we see repeated in the Bible. And then once the child is born, Samson, he is set apart as a Nazirite. It's a religious vow. And a part of that vow entails that his hair goes uncut. Because of this, God gives him great strength physically. But Samson has a weakness for the ladies. His hair is cut off by Delilah. He's taken captive by the Philistines who he had previously single-handedly defeated. But in the end, God returns Samson's strength for one final scene that really brings down the house. Sympathy laughs, but I'll take those two. If you were to move beyond the book of Judges, the next book is Ruth. Ruth is a redemption story. It's ultimately a story of the providence of God, the redemption of God, which, when you think about it, all of God's stories are redemption stories. And if you're not familiar with Ruth, I'd encourage you to read those short 4 chapters. Boaz, who plays a primary role in the story of Ruth, he's significant for many reasons. One of the reasons is because his mother is someone that we studied last week, Rahab. Rahab and then Ruth, both of whom are prominent in the lineage of Jesus. Very cool stuff. But here's the message from Judges. God tells his people, I want you to be faithful to me. I want you to be faithful to me because I am your God and because I love you. I want you to be faithful to me because I am your God and because I love you. And because I'm your God and because I love you, do as I say. The only problem is that obedience is not Israel's strong suit. Now, don't give them too hard of a time, because this is where we factor into the story. Because obedience is too often not our strong suit. And this is the theme, really, that we find throughout the Bible. It's the theme that the gospel of Jesus is designed around. The entire plan and the entire design behind redemption that's held out in the gospel of Jesus. Because obedience is not our strong suit either. And this is where we connect to the story of Judges. God, he tells them, have nothing to do with the sin and the sinfulness that's going on around you. Do not participate. Do not be a part. Do not be brought down by others. Don't be brought down by the sinful people around you. But Israel's response to God is, God, these folks aren't all that bad. Yes, they behave badly. Yes, they do hood rat things with their friends, but they're not all that bad. We can share life with them without being brought down by them. And they, like we, too often toy with sinfulness. And when they do, inevitably, God gives them over to their defeat. Now, once defeated, Israel, they cry out to God. And so they cry out to God out of their distress. God raises up a judge. Things get better, but then they fall right back into their ungodly practices. And so I think the story of Judges asks a very human question. I think the story of Judges asks the question, why is it that we distance ourselves so often from the very God that we say that we adore and know that we require? Why do we distance ourselves from the very God that we say we adore and know that we require? Why this constant roller coaster of faith? Why this roller coaster of emotion? And you see, it's not a matter of Israel not being an influence upon the other nations. I don't want to blur the lines here. The call of Israel is the same call that we have, to be light in a world of darkness. But they, like we, are too often overtaken by it. And again, don't mishear me, because the best way for you to know if you're loving God and loving others, you know the best way, the best barometer, the best litmus test for that? To know if you or I, if we're loving God or loving others, the way to determine if we're loving God and loving others is to ask our neighbor. Not to be able to articulate some sort of litany of beliefs or a belief system, as important as it is to know our beliefs and belief system. You want to know if you're being faithful to God? If you're loving God and loving others? Ask those who know you best. In Israel is pursuing practices, and they're engaging in practices that not only have been forbidden by God, but they've been forbidden by God because they're sinful practices. You tracking with me? And like Proverbs 26:11 describes, I didn't even put this verse on the screen because it's a confrontational it's an abrupt sort of verse. Proverbs 26:11 describes, like a dog returns to its vomit. I don't get to use that word very often in preaching, but it's there. Like a dog returns to its vomit, so does a fool who continues to do foolish things. You see, it's not about knowing the right thing. That's really easy. It's about doing the right thing. And I think about, especially in the world in which we find ourselves living today, to quote E.O. Wilson, we are drowning in information, but we are starving for wisdom. We're drowning in information, but we are starving for wisdom. And so I wonder, with the backdrop of Israel and the time of the judges, I wonder if you've ever struggled with an area of sin in your life, with a particular sin, with a particular... Just find a millennial, they can turn it off for you. I wonder if you've ever struggled with a particular area of sin in your life. And when you're in the depth of that sin, when you're in the pit of that sin, maybe you have found yourself making all kinds of promises to yourself, to others, to God. All sorts of promises of how you'll never do this again, whatever this is. And maybe even at the time you mean it. You genuinely mean it. You see, this is the story of Judges. This is the application of Judges to us. Have you ever said, I'll never do this again? I'm never going to find myself in this mess again. I'll never take another drink. I'll never have another look. I'll never use this drug. I'll never take this pill. I'll never behave in that way again. I'll never think that thought again. I'll never engage in that activity again. But like a dog that returns to its vomit, so a fool does the same foolish things again and again. And you find yourself at the same bottom of the same pit in the same state. But you see, there's hope in this because of the gospel of Jesus. There's hope in this because of what God offers through Jesus. King David, who knew a thing or two about this, King David in Psalm 40, he writes this, the first three verses that Danny read for us a few minutes ago. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me, and He heard my cry. He lifted me out of the pit, out of the mud and the mire, and He set my feet on a rock, and He gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and will put their trust in the Lord. David, King David, Psalm 40, David who knew a thing or two about moral failure. We're going to get to his story over the next couple of weeks. In Psalm 40, he moves from this image of being stuck. He moves from this image of drowning, of being trapped, and he moves to the image of salvation, of standing in confidence before God. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me. He heard my cry. David describing this outcry to God, just like Israel would cry out to God during the time of Judges. He turned to me. He heard my cry. He lifted me out of the pit, out of the mud, out of the mire. He set my feet on a rock, and He gave me a firm place to stand, and He put a new song in my mouth. A hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Now, I've never stood in quicksand. I don't know if you have. Maybe you've experienced this. But I know from watching enough National Geographic whenever I was a kid, that if ever standing in quicksand, the thing to do is what? Stop resisting. Stop fighting. That's the very best thing you can do. If you find yourself in the bottom of a pit that you have dug for yourself, do you know the very best thing you can do? Put down the shovel and stop digging. That's the best thing you can do in the moment. But it has to come down to a point where a decision is made. Oftentimes, that decision is made in the bottom of that pit. A decision that's made that the cycle has to stop. Ultimately, this is, of course, only possible through the strength of God, only possible through God's provision and the intervention and role of the Holy Spirit within us. Why is it that we too often distance ourselves from the very God that we say we adore and know we require? Maybe it's because we've not yet decided that we want to be His rather than our own. C.S. Lewis writes this: "It is a dreadful truth that the state of having to depend solely upon God is what we dread the most. It's good for Him to force us to do so. But dear me, how difficult it is to feel that it is good at the time." You see, when we reach out to God, He promises that He will lift us up and He'll put our feet on solid ground. Why is it that we resist Him? Why is depending solely upon God what we dread the most? Because depending upon God, and I would also add, depending upon God and depending upon others, that's the way it's supposed to work. We see this as weakness, but that's the enemy whispering that to us. Depending upon God and depending upon others, that's the whole point of loving God and loving others. We depend upon God and we depend upon others because that's the call and the design of the gospel. That's how it all works. And so maybe if it's not working, maybe it's not working because you're not working it the way it's supposed to work. Tracking with me? The Apostle Paul, he writes this in Philippians chapter 3, latter part of verse 13 and verse 14. He says, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead. Now, it might be that whatever damage has been done prior to you being in that pit, it might be that you never gained back what you lost. But the gospel affords us the ability, the capacity to be able to move forward and to start new in kingdom ways. And so forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, the Apostle Paul continues and he says, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus. The story of Judges tells the story of a fickle and wavering people, but of a God who is faithful and unchanging. And maybe that's the message for us today, especially within the tenuous times that we find ourselves living. Maybe today, maybe there's someone today who knows that you are in the bottom of that pit. God will lift you out. It's the gospel of Jesus. He will lift you out of the muck and the mire and the misery of sin, and He will place your feet on solid ground. All you need but do is to trust in Him. Rely upon Him. Rely upon others. Rely upon the resources that God provides. Rely upon His Holy Spirit and cry out for deliverance. And make the decision that from this point forward things are going to be different. Maybe you are tired of being in the state or the condition that you're in. My response to that? Good. Good. Because that could potentially be a step in the right direction. There may be someone today who's headed down a wrong path, and you know it. Reach out to him today. Refuse to go down that road so that a story of faith might be told. My prayer is that there are those today whose feet are planted firmly upon the solid rock of Jesus. And if that's you, if that's us, I think we should just take a single moment today, sometime today, to set aside some time to thank God for being faithful to you. As we bring things to a conclusion, maybe if responding to God in faithfulness is upon your heart, my hope is that you would have the courage to do whatever God requires of you. Whether that's reaching out to a brother or sister and asking for prayer, for strength. Maybe that means coming forward this morning during the invitation song and asking us as a body of believers to gather around you and to pray for you as you start new with God. Start over with Him. Maybe even with others. And perhaps this morning, if you've never been baptized into Christ, I pray that you would respond to the faithfulness of God and being faithful and being baptized. If we can bless you in some way, it'd be our honor to do so. Come forward as we stand and as we sing.